At first glance, you'd swear you had landed in the South Louisiana marsh. In places, it seems a mirror image. For thousands of years, water spilled out of Lake Okeechobee and crept toward the Gulf of Mexico through sawgrass, swamp, and by Louisiana standards, giant mangrove trees, what Floridians proudly call their river of grass. Ada Eric, a hydrologist with the Everglades Foundation, explains the plumbing here used to be a lot different.
Water would flow as a sheet over the land.
The Everglades are the only place in America you will find storks, the only place on Earth where alligators and crocodiles coexist.
There are no other Everglades in the world.
Just as in Louisiana's river delta, man sought to improve on nature, draining, damming, diverting water into canals, an elaborate network of arteries taming what seemed a vast wasteland.
Everybody looks at swamps and says, well, you know, that's a useless thing. No, it's not.
Developers and farmers found other uses for the water. Over half the Everglades were lost as these new highways of water diverted the flow to Florida's east and west coast, putting the system on life support. Parts of the river of grass ran dry.
The Everglades is like a giant jigsaw puzzle. It's even more complicated. It's almost like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Congress approved the Everglades Restoration Plan in the year 2000, $10 billion over 30 years. The idea? Mimic nature to the extent possible, to turn back the clock, providing a drink of fresh water for areas to the south. Just as in Louisiana, there's been a lot of frustration in Florida over the last years. Congress would approve projects, but there never seemed to be any money. Until recently. The Tamiami Trail, an east-west highway in South Florida, effectively acts as one long levee, choking Everglades National Park. Today, crews have elevated the first of 6 miles of roadway that will restore more of the historic flow. The Army Corps of Engineers and the local water district completed the first major projects, including diverting some water back into the park. And crews are now restoring a giant wetland area to the north.
Why should people care about the Everglades? It's like asking, why should you care about the Washington Monument or the Statue of Liberty or the Grand Canyon or any of the other great monuments or places that we have in our country? The Everglades are part of our natural history. It is a gift to us, and it's our responsibility to make sure that this gift is passed on to future generations.
This issue is not just for tree huggers. Turns out fresh water feeding the Everglades also seeps into a giant aquifer, providing drinking water to 7 million people, including all of Greater Miami.
When I come and I talk to people about birds, they're like, whatever, my favorite kind of bird is fried. So it's like, all right, that's not going to work. And then you tell them, well, do you like to drink some water with that? And that's when they realize, okay, this is important.
Save our river! Save our river!
Last summer, protesters greeted Florida Governor Rick Scott, essentially demanding he fix the plumbing. Heavy rains forced the Corps to divert even more water than usual into estuaries on Florida's east and west coasts.
This is microcystis algae, the toxic blue-green algae.
Polluted water sparked algae blooms, killed wildlife, and devastated fishing communities in what locals dubbed the lost summer.
It drove home the issue of why this matters.
Florida fights some of the same obstacles as Louisiana, a huge backlog of water projects around the country, each competing for limited dollars.
We're not getting the federal authorizations and funding resources that we need.
That slows the pace of recovery, yet for those projects that have been completed, the early signs are positive as vegetation springs back to life and some wildlife returns. Experts say it's too early to say how well the projects are working.
Of course, we didn't impact the Everglades overnight. It's going to take many, many years to correct a lot of the mistakes that we now realize.
The Everglades' staunchest advocates concede others are watching Florida closely to see if this first major restoration actually works.
Because it really is the model for many other projects. If we can do this successfully, we hope it is a template for success that can be used elsewhere.
I think we've got a one-time shot at this. We are on the right track. If we fail, well, the Everglades fails. There is no option for failure.
For centuries, long before hotel resorts sprouted along the Florida Keys, Florida Bay was a wonderland. The Everglades fed the blue-green waters of the bay just enough fresh water to create a world-class estuary between the Keys and the mainland. But this is the intracoastal.
Yep.
Next up, New Orleans.
Yeah, long way to go.
Dr. Jerry Lorenz of Audubon, Florida, has spent the last quarter century watching a system in near collapse.
It's in sick shape.
At times, it had to seem like conducting an autopsy. Historically, fresh water flowed south, beginning not far from Orlando, on a slow trek to the Gulf of Mexico, slower than the slowest Louisiana bayou. Cities and farms sprouted, sticking more and more straws into the waters that once flowed into this river of grass and starving the system. This canal just outside Everglades National Park channeled water to the east instead of south. The park and Florida Bay starved for fresh water.
And from that point on, things really deteriorated in Florida Bay.
The bay turned very salty. Even the reef suffered as nutrients from fertilizers poured into the system and smothered some of the coral.
We had massive amounts of seagrass die-off in the early 90s, huge algal blooms for the last 20 years or so. When you have those conditions, eventually it just went into a collapse.
Today, Florida has taken the first steps toward redoing the plumbing, raising part of a roadway that acts as a levee, restoring wetlands, and sending more water to the south. Sport fisherman Ken Braid likes what he sees.
From everything that I've heard, it's a very positive move.
At times, restoration efforts moved at a glacial pace. But those projects that have been completed seem to be bearing results.
The native vegetation is coming back naturally on its own without replanting. We're seeing the wildlife activity pick up. We're definitely seeing the ability of the natural system to heal itself.
Florida's plan is the largest restoration effort ever attempted in the history of the world. Louisiana's master plan would be the largest ever envisioned, at 5 times the price. Florida's $10 billion dream enjoys some natural advantages. It's easier to tug at the hearts of taxpayers, if not their congressmen, when you're saving a national park.
Those are things that, the people of America own, something that they have a stake in.
Tulane environmental law expert Mark Davis points out Florida puts up half the money.
But federal dollars are going to follow local and state dollars. We may hope it's other than that, but that's not the way it's going to work.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels to Louisiana. We don't have the complicating factor of our land sinking.
Florida has its own concerns about sea level rise, which threatens to contaminate Miami's drinking water supply.
The best way to combat that is to make sure there's so much fresh water going back into the system, and that's what Everglades restoration does, that it literally pushes the salt water back.
Yet waters flowing south today carry a huge load of nutrients, fertilizers from farm runoff.
Water is our lifeblood. That's the only way that we can survive. It brings in tourism, it helps our economy.
Florida water districts have agreed to make large investments in reservoirs, acting as giant kidneys to treat polluted water before it reaches the glades. In Louisiana, fishermen have sounded alarm bells about plans to channel massive amounts of water into the marsh.
Without cohesiveness, you're fighting the whole time, and you won't actually be able to get the end goal.
The Everglades Coalition boasts more than 50 groups dedicated to the cause. But Tulane's Mark Davis points out progress in Florida came only after bitter fights. Lawsuits over violations of the Clean Water Act. Judges required Florida to clean up water heading into the Everglades.
Good things don't just happen. They have to be made to happen.
Jerry Lorenz, who's tracking bird populations in Florida Bay, sees some hopeful signs. He's documented greater water flow and improved salinity in northeast Florida Bay and more bird nests.
It'll take time, but at least the things have stopped going into decline.
Being first out of the gate entails a certain risk. No one has a model for what Florida is attempting.
And they're trying things that have never been tried before. It's not a sure bet.
As Louisiana struggles to begin its comprehensive effort, Florida moves to restore a paradise nearly lost.